Well, welcome to the recording of the Book of Acts for New Testament Survey. The Acts of the Apostles. The purpose of the book is really found in the first chapter. There's a key verse here, chapter 1, verse 8, and it is to spread the gospel, to be my witnesses, he says. And there's this Greek word here on the left side. I believe it's this. I'm looking to do a marker, but I can't seem to get it. At any rate, martyres, that's what these letters are. And here we go. Mu, alpha, Re, tau, upsilon, Re, epsilon, sigma. And those are the Greek letters of martyrs. This is a transliteration. Martyrs. Martyrs is where you get that from, and it's about witnesses. And what they are, they're truly meaning they watched the things that they talk about. They actually saw these events. They are true eyewitnesses of these accounts. And in page 314, Bart Ehrman mentions verisimilitude. This is a word, and when he's talking, I think really about a novel, and that's what he really looks at the book of Acts like. But this verisimilitude is a word I heard often about the whole of the Bible and of the New Testament. It's a work consistent within itself, using themes and stories portraying the true account of how God works with his people and how his people work with their God over the centuries. And that's what we find in the whole Bible. But the book of Acts is really showing us how the church, and we're going to see this purpose verse from chapter 1, verse 8, play out. It says, you will be spreading this good news. You'll be my witnesses from Jerusalem, right here, and to Judea, the southern part. And I've got some circles here to point out Jerusalem and then Judea in this southern area of Israel at the time. And then on through Samaria. And Samaria is that portion just north of Jerusalem, which was kind of a place that no Jew wanted to walk through because there was a bunch of half-breeds living there. They weren't full-blood Jews, and they looked down on them. They weren't good people, and as far as the Jewish leadership were concerned. But this verse goes ahead and says, you're going to spread my news from this small area, Jerusalem, to Judea, and then bigger, broader area of Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And we see that played out in the book of Acts. In the first chapter or two, we see Jerusalem, and then we see Judea as the word spread out, and the activities of the book. And then in Samaria in chapter 8, and in chapter 9 it really kicks off through 10, 11, 13 especially, showing the ends of the earth with Paul's first missionary journey. There are several purposes I think we find within the book, and the New Testament, or the NIV, the New International version of the Study Bible, has this to present a history of the church based really back on Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus talks to Peter and he says, upon this rock I will build my church. Jesus used the word church twice, once here in Matthew 16, technically 3 times, twice here, and then once in chapter 18, if you want to look that up. Also then, the book of Acts is to give a defense for what they believe, and Peter does that in a couple of his speeches. It provides a guide for where the church is going, It certainly depicts a triumph of Christianity in the face of persecution, because it shows how they didn't just produce a guide and they gave a defense, they survived. And they were victorious and spread the word around the world as Jesus not only predicted but challenged his people to do. Another key verse of this book, I think, is really in chapter 2, verse 42, where the church polity, or the idea of what the church is gathering for. And there's four things where they devoted themselves, the apostles did, to the apostles' teaching, or the church people devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, the breaking of bread, which is kind of an idea of communion, and then to prayer. That's really what the church was about. And remember, the church, ecclesia is the Greek word, is about people, not about buildings. The church is, the book of Acts is a historical book. You see, there are many different places and mentioned in this book, located by archaeologists throughout. You have separate countries like Egypt, Greece, Italy. There's some islands like Crete and Cyprus, and lots of cities we still know about today: Jerusalem, Corinth, Thessalonica, Athens, Ephesus, Rome, and more. So it's a real historically based book, and we're going to see some of these actions here in this video. The theme is really the growth of the church. We see its expansion around the world, and some terms you'll need to get to know for a quiz is what church is, the Gentiles, the gospel. The Pentecost is a holy day at that time. Atonement, what that means in doctrinal ideas from the New Testament and how they saw that in the book of Acts especially, but it's seen also in Romans and Galatians. The we passages, and I'll explain that when we get to it. Theophilus, who that is. Synagogue, and what that is, and who is the Sanhedrin, or maybe you might designate it as a what. There's several things in the content of the book of Acts. I'm going to briefly go through. You can read it. You're to read about a third of the book. I think there are 10 chapters of reading material through this book that I want you to make a summary of. But the very beginning really is chapter 2, the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost. That spurs on some growth and some challenges, which growth always does bring on challenges, doesn't it? Doesn't matter what's growing, some challenges come. Stephen is the first martyr, and as we use it in today's term, as one who dies for what they believe in. He was definitely a witness to many events, but he also was the first death, believing in what the church stands for. Philip is what it's all about in chapter 8. It's the only chapter that mentions Philip. Saul is converted in chapter 9, and then we have several, most of the rest of the book is about him. It skips a few chapters. It gets to chapter 13 before we see him again. Peter comes in chapter 10 and 11, converts some people, shares a vision. Herod it persecutes the church at the outset of chapter 12, where James, the apostle James, is beheaded, and persecution is furthered. And then at the end of the chapter, Herod himself dies because he doesn't give any credit to God, to his voice, apparently his good speech. So Paul's first missionary journey begins in chapter 13, and this is a picture of that journey to give you an idea of where he went. So Paul starts, he starts here in Antioch, goes from there to Seleucia, and then takes a trip on a ship, apparently, goes to Cyprus, and then he goes to these places. It's called Perga, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and then he goes back, and I think it's really kind of cool in this area. I think it's in Iconium or maybe Lystra. He's stoned, left for dead. He gets up, goes back into town, leaves, goes to another city, and then comes back. I ain't kind of in your face, people. You can stone me if you want, but I'm going to continue to share God's good news. And that is his first journey in those two chapters. Then we get to chapter 15 and we see Paul's second journey, and this is really clear. He starts here in Caesarea, goes up to Antioch again, stays on land for a while, goes to these same cities where he was stoned. And we don't know all the places, but he does mention then Troas. He sails across to Neapolis and goes to Philippi, Apollonia, Thessalonica, Berea, and he probably sails. He doesn't mention any of the town in Greece. To Athens, and then over to Corinth, and then over here to Ephesus. He spends a couple years, and then he goes back to Caesarea. This is a spread of Christianity by this chart. It's kind of hard to read because it's the white portions that throw you off, generally expecting white to be water. But the white portion in this picture is water. The blue portions are how far the gospel had spread by the 3rd, 4th century, middle of the 4th century, and the dark blue, kind of spotty. But the light blue, then it's further spread and clear across here, even to Spain, you see. And then even to England and Ireland. Clear up here in Germany. These parts are mentioned. This is part maybe of Russia. Nonetheless, Turkey, this is all of Turkey right here. Syria, Lebanon, and then this is Egypt, and then go down here to other lands across Africa. And that's where Christianity has spread. This is the Mediterranean Sea, as you probably can tell now. The second part of the content of the book starts where we left off in chapter 15. Paul is there visiting the church council. This is the first council of the church. Peter steps up, and this is his last speech, and he talks to people. We're going to talk about speeches here briefly in a couple minutes, and then Paul goes on his second missionary journey. Then he has a third one mentioned, and people talk about a fourth one actually, but it's not listed in the book of Acts. He's arrested in chapter 21. And then is taken to Rome, but has a shipwreck on the way. Those two chapters are dealing with that, the last two chapters of the book. So what we find in the book of Acts are several details of where people are going, why they are going, what happens when they are there, and then the speeches that happen by different people. So Peter and Paul are not the only two people giving speeches, and technically some would say there are more than 7 by Peter, more than 8 by Paul, but we're going to stick with that number, and it doesn't matter how many. You can look for yourself, study it, and make your own case. But we see also Gamaliel, well-known teacher. Paul was taught by him, and he gave a speech in chapter 5. Stephen gave a long speech. The longest speech in the whole book is by Stephen, and he was stoned in the end. James gave a short speech, was killed. No, this is not James the apostle. This is the brother, the half-brother of Jesus, and Peter. And James kind of give a defense for what's going on in chapter 15. Demetrius then just a Gentile, he gives a speech, a town clerk, and then Festus. Not all these people are Christians. Not all of them are giving any speech or information about church polity or doctrine or anything. They're just telling what's going on at the time. So through the speeches, we're going to take a look at the first one of Peter more extensively. Peter's is technically his second speech. His first one is found in Acts chapter 1. This is the way I'm going with it. I don't remember how the book exactly deals. if he even mentions the first one, but I would say chapter 1 when Paul or Peter is trying to get people to um, get the apostles together and vote on a replacement for Judas Iscariot. That's in chapter 1, starting in verse 16. Chapter 2, they're together, maybe in the same place on the day of Pentecost. They're in a room, and then they go out and they're in the temple area. And on this special holy day, it's a feast day for the Jews, one of the main three feast days. The Sabbath was one. The day of Pentecost is 50 days later. It's a holy day. It's really their first harvest. What some things you might get in early spring for a harvest. This is the day of Pentecost, like May. We're talking May 1st, maybe. And I think wheat would be ready by then in Israel. So they're meeting there, and something happens. A loud noise. People start talking in other languages, and I'm going to use some Greek words here. There are two words that are used about the language used in early in the chapter. It's called glossolalia. This is the Greek word, and here's the way it's worked. It technically means tongues, that muscle in your mouth. You taste with and you speak with. It's a tongue, and that's what it's saying. It's glossolalia. It's used 3 times. And then there's a idia dialecto. That's what it looks like in English. And it's really speaking about your own language. But I think you recognize idioms. Idia, dialecto, dialect. It's your own very personal, very unique language. We have a unique language, and there are different dialects of English across the country. There's an expert of this in Pittsburgh. And apparently I have a what's called Ozarkian dialect, the way I pronounce certain words. People pronounce like dollar, for a dollar, or shots for shorts. That's their dialect. You might guess where they're coming from. The point of bringing this up is that Peter recognized the apostles were given a unique gift to speak in languages they did not know. And not just okay, but in such a specific dialect that the people that were there for this day of Pentecost, this holy day, Jews from Egypt, Jews from across Africa, Jews from clear across Asia and further north of Greece, they were hearing Peter and the apostles speak in their very specific dialects. And so Peter wants to alleviate any confusion. So he stands up and starts telling the people, my friends here, they're not drunk. You know how it is when you hear someone speaking another language you don't know? You first thought maybe they're talking about me. Second thought is, ooh, that's weird. Wonder how they understand that. But then you probably realize, okay, they're just speaking in their own language and they understand it. I don't. I feel left out. I need to go away now. Peter wanted to alleviate any fears of people of this unique event going on. And he preached to them the first really gospel message. It's found here in Acts 2. And what he did is so unique. He quoted a lot of Old Testament scriptures. He basically relayed the idea to these Gentile Jews, these Jews of non-Jewish background, some of them, that listen, you need to recognize that this is a miracle. Jesus performed miracles just like it was taught that it would happen. David talked about him, and God made Jesus not made Jesus, but Jesus is a descendant of David, and God made this Jesus whom you know. and you heard about just, you know what, a couple months ago, 50 days ago, made him both Lord and Christ. He says that in verse 36. And the response of the crowd in the temple area was a question. What do we do? Peter then responded to their question with, you need to be repentant, and you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins and for the reception of this Holy Spirit that you're seeing here today. And so the church baptized 3,000 people that day. And part of what was going on with Peter and his speech was this. He kept using the word you. You guys did this. You did that. You did this. And he's saying that you crucified Jesus. And it's your fault that he died. But God has made him both Lord and Christ. At any rate, he made it very personal. I think it's important to recognize that in these other speeches I'm going to just highlight real quick. I mentioned this one, chapter 1, he talked to the apostles and their friendly group. Chapter 2 here, he's talking to the Gentile Jews, and I'll mention what I mean by that here in a few moments. But he's talking to the people in Jerusalem that came to the day of Pentecost. In chapter 3, he's talking to onlookers after healing in the temple. He healed a crippled beggar, and people were totally amazed and got him into trouble, and they put him and John into prison because of that. And so in chapter 4, he had to reply, and he stood up and talked to the Sanhedrin. And then again in chapter 5, he talked to the Sanhedrin. And this religious ruling class group wanted to deal with Peter. And then in chapter 10, Peter responded to a group at a guy by the name of Cornelius, his house. He was a Gentile, became a believer, but he was not a Jew necessarily. But actually, I think he was, but he became a Christian after this speech of Peter. And the last speech of Peter found chapter 15. And from there on, we don't see Peter at all. And here he is talking, Peter is to the apostles and the elders of the church. And this is where he says that we are saved by grace. Peter says that in this chapter, verse 11, in fact. So this is to help us recognize again how big this is in the courtyard of the temple, how big it was. They would have been gathering on the day of Pentecost, maybe here or over here. And Peter would have stood up somewhere and said, you know, the whole thing. I just wanted to remind you of this picture. The Jerusalem Temple Mound is the largest temple mound in ancient history. 37 acres. That's huge. But anyway, I just want to point that. And the temple itself wasn't all that big, but it was quite a grand thing when you add all of the accoutrements, if you will, around it, the whole mound. It became quite the deal. So Acts through speeches now with Paul. Paul had his first speech and first sermon really in chapter 13. In a synagogue, responding to a message that he was requested to give any word of encouragement to the people, Paul addressed them as Gentiles. Gentiles, even though they were Jews, they were proselytes. So this is where it can get confusing sometimes. They were Gentile Jews. That what they meant. What I mean is that these people were non-Jewish people from the descendants of Abraham or the descendants of Israel. They were not. But they did become Jews in religious activity. So Jewish history has always been a little confusing, and when it comes to census taking, it becomes a little confusing because who do we count as a Jew? Those people who practice it or those people who are genetically coded as a Jew? Well, the Gentile Jews were those who practiced it. And sometimes the language can be a little bit confusing because Paul addresses these people in a synagogue as Gentiles. They were proselytes. And then he gave him a brief history of Israel and Egypt through the judges and King David. And he said, God worked through this king and promised him that he would bring a savior to the world. It wasn't John the Baptist, by the way. John said no, it wasn't him too. But the message of salvation was sent, but not recognized. He was then executed and raised from the dead. The good news is that God is faithful. God kept his promise. God kept his word and always does. Even when we are faithless, God is faithful. And Paul preaches this through his epistles and at this very sermon. It is through Jesus that the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed, and those who believe in him are justified from the law of Moses. That is, we are exonerated, if you will. Through Jesus' activity on the cross, we don't have to obey the law. When you believe in him, he takes care of your legal business. You just have to love. But at any rate, that's Paul's first sermon. He doesn't mention love in that. But then his next sermon in chapter 17, Paul is on at Mars Hill, just underneath the Acropolis in Athens, and he speaks there not to Christians. He doesn't speak to necessarily Jews. He's speaking to philosophers and maybe some agnostics. He speaks to a group of people that wanted to hear about his new ideas and his new message. But anyway, that was a unique one. And then in chapter 19, Paul speaks to a small group in Ephesus. He stays there for 2 years and then preaches in a synagogue and then at other places, and ended up having to leave. In chapter 20, he has to explain to the elders that he's not going to be seen by the by the Ephesian elders anymore. He meets with them on the beach. They cry, and he says goodbye. And in chapter 22, he speaks to a crowd of soldiers that had arrested him, and the soldiers are now protecting him. And then in chapter 24, he speaks to Felix and to Tertullus as the high priest while he's in custody. And in chapter 26, he speaks to King Agrippa. I would like to point out, between chapter 24, he appeals to Caesar in chapter 25, verse 11. That speech isn't on here. It's rather short, but he just says, I appeal to Caesar. And so in chapter 26, he finds himself before King Agrippa at the prison in Caesarea. And then in chapter 28, he is in Rome. So this is the Athenian Acropolis, and this is an artsy drawing. And if I may, this is Mars Hill here. I believe this is where Paul would have spoke to some people about some philosophy. The Epicureans and the Stoics were there. And this is the Acropolis, and I have a picture of myself and my wife up here. The Acropolis, this is the Parthenon, and the Parthenon actually had a roof on it up until the 1800s. And a general was storing his black powder in there. And guess what happened to the black powder? It blew up and blew out on the sides of the Parthenon, and it blew off of the roof. And such a tragedy. Such a terrible thing. There were no pictures, almost in the time of picture-taking era. But bummer. Nope. No go. And then that became shambles. But at any rate, here's my picture of Randy and myself at the in front of the Acropolis. They're in Athens, Greece. Um, Chapter 17 is where he was, and it's quite the big area. Another picture, and I want to point out this is taken from a different direction, but Mars Hill would have been further to the left over here. And today, there's nothing there. There are three accounts of Paul's conversion. Paul was converted in chapter 9. He talks about it to a crowd in Jerusalem in chapter 22, and then a personal account again related to King Agrippa, and tried to convert Agrippa on the spot after that. And it's really kind of fascinating. And the accounts are just a little bit different, but not enough for concern. I think they're basically the same thing. Authorship, I think it's Luke. It's very similar to the opening of the Gospel of Luke, has similar language and a lot of the similar themes. The we sections I mentioned, there are 3 of them. And in these sections, you can read, as you read these parts, these portions, Paul mentions, or rather, Luke as the author anyway, mentions we. And it sounds like he was with Paul in part of this journey. Then in Colossians 4 is where, I think 4:11, but is where you find Paul writing, and he says, say hi, or Luke says hi, the physician. Evidence doesn't appear as early as or frequently as that for the Gospels or Pauline epistles as to who wrote the book of Acts. Yet, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr all clearly allude to it. In the Martyrian canon, around 160 AD, does say Luke wrote this book as one volume as a follow-up for the Gospel. Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria both quote it and give Luke credit for its authorship, as did Irenaeus and Eusebius. And then these we passages again. So it's chapter 4 of Colossians, verse 14, that the Luke is mentioned. He is the most likely candidate, and Luke is who I would say. Many other scholars over the years have said that. Our book says they're approximately written between 80 and 85. I think it was earlier than that, as I was taught under people who learned through Thiessen and Tenney and Guthrie and many others, ending the book with an abrupt end after Paul's arrival at Rome, which is around 59 in the common areas, what CE stands for. I still use AD, so it doesn't matter. And I think a couple of other reasons come up that I think that Luke wrote this book. The absence of the death of Paul, which happened in 64 approximately. Peter's death was around the same time, both in Rome, I believe, and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is not mentioned. So I would think it would be written before that. I think Luke would feel the need maybe to say what the church was doing after the death of Paul and Peter, but he doesn't. Here's a timeline. This is from a conservative group, the people who do believe that Luke is the author, and following what the events go on. And there's one real particular important data about Corinth. But here, the ascension of Christ, pretty much everyone agrees that Jesus was killed at AD 30. The day of Pentecost was just 50 days later, so it'd be the same year. Stephen was maybe 5 years later. Conversion of Saul around that time, shortly after the martyrdom of Stephen. Then Paul went on his first missionary journey. He did not journey to Mississippi, just to clarify. 47, and then the second one around 49. But here's the important one in Corinth of around 50 to 52. We have a stone that is talking about a leader in Corinth that mentions that, and Paul mentions him as well in Corinth when he was there. So we put that together and recognize, okay, if he was there, that had to have been at that particular time. whether you believe the chronology of Acts or not. This is the way I would present it. Paul was in Corinth at the time that this rock mentions the leader in Corinth, chapter 18 of the book of Acts. And I'm going to look it up. Hopefully you can find it very quickly so that we won't take too much time. So Claudius was the Caesar at that time, and in Corinth there was a leader, and I'm stretching really quick to find this guy. Gallio, here we do, and find it in verse 12. So Gallio was a proconsul of Achaia, and it's found in a town in Greece, and they have it hanging up, and I've been there, and I'll think of it later, maybe. Wasn't prepared to mention all that, but this is the timeline. And this is the last slide. So the destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70. The book ends with Paul in house arrest, so that was around 59. And you can look that up in Acts chapter 28. And summarize this video and turn it in through Red Zone with all their proper headings and page number. Thank you very much.